A year out from the 2012 London Olympics, a South African lightweight rowing crew placed fifth in a B final in Bled, Slovenia. The result qualified them for the Olympics the following year, but their time meant that they were way off a medal. It's incredible, then, that they won gold in London the following year. Welcome to the Luke Alfred Show. I have 30 years of experience on the front lines of sports journalism, covering some of the biggest games in cricket, rugby, the FIFA World Cup and even the Olympic Games. Come and join me as we learn about the greatest sports stories you've never heard. I'm Luke Alfred and welcome to the show. The following is an extract I wrote for my book Vuvuzela Dawn, South Africa's lightweight rowers power to Olympic gold, London, August 2012. Eskild Ebbesen, a wiry Dane with the penetrating stare of a Viking, is the greatest lightweight rower alive. He and his crew dominated lightweight rowing in the late 1990s, winning 3 consecutive World Cups, and although there was a hiccup in the Sydney Olympics of 2000, where they only won bronze, they extended their authority over the next 10 years. They won gold in Athens and followed it up 4 years later with gold in Beijing. Their story is remarkable for its fusion of consistency, longevity, and a peerless ability to peak at the right time. Ebbesen's is a household name in Denmark, rare for a rower. He became so much of a national hero that he appeared more than once on Denmark's equivalent of Strictly Come Dancing. He is, to coin a phrase from South African rower James Thompson, quote, bigger than Richie McCaw. By the time Ebbesen arrived in London in 2012, he was a legend, what some called a beast, what others called the Michael Phelps of lightweight rowing. Everyone knew when he was there, and they all knew when he was in the water. They didn't necessarily turn their heads, but Ebbesen had a presence. Over the span of his career, he moved to the front of the boat, occupying the lonely bow, an even better place to remind you that he was there. Like all legends, Ebbesen would behave in ways befitting his status, not in a bumped-up, tantrum-throwing way of an athletic superstar, but in the psychologically calculating way of the seasoned sporting campaigner. He would often use up every minute of the 2-hour window in the weighing room before a race, sweating out excess fluid so he could dip below the mandatory 72.5 kilogram mark. A fellow rower almost always conceded 2.5 kilograms to him, meaning they would weigh at 67.5 kilograms, with the mean weight of the crew being 70 kilograms per man. Fours in lightweight boats can't weigh more than a combined 280 kilograms, although one exception over the 70 kilogram mean is acceptable. Ebbesen was regularly that exception. Like Shane Warne, pausing with knowing nonchalance at the top of his mark, so Ebbesen could make people wait. And make them wait he frequently did. Such brinkmanship tends to get noticed. Everyone gets weighed at much the same time, so there is a busy parade of coming and going through the weighing area. Once crews have achieved the cut-off weight, they are free to go and have breakfast, loading up on Nutella-smeared croissants or Red Bull or porridge prior to racing. If one of their number is sweating in a booth, they all have to wait. The others watch their waiting. Those watching invariably wonder whether all of this is serving some purpose and wonder what that purpose might be. The Danes were not only a powerful crew for 15 years, but they were sufficiently mysterious about their methods to provoke intrigue, consternation even. Since lightweight rowing became a feature of the Olympics in 1996, the Danes had earned a reputation for going out fast and aggressively. They were brutal and protected their secrets. Ebbesen was at the very core of that brutality. Quote, it was quite scary to see the way he made everyone wait while he sweated out the surplus weight, said John Smith, a member of the South African lightweight fours crew of the period. It blew our minds. We always wondered, but to be honest, we were never able to unlock the Danes' secret. Ebbesen, who turned 42 months prior to the London Olympics, was 8 when Sizwe Ndlovu, the oldest member of the South African crew, was born on the 24th of September 1980. In turn, Ndlovu, the son of a KwaZulu-Natal taxi driver and a domestic worker mother, was, at nearly 32, some way older than his fellow crew members in the South African boat in London in 2012. Matt Britton was 25, James Thompson, also 25, although 6 months older than Britton, with Smith being the baby, having just turned 22. Summers in northern KwaZulu-Natal are hot, and when he was growing up, Ndlovu and his friends came up with an ingenious method of splashing about in the farm dams without risking being drowned. They saved 2-liter plastic milk cartons, yoking them together in a belt. With the belt around their waist and holding a carton in each hand, they plunged into the water. Quote, "We couldn't really swim that way," says Ndlovu, but it also meant that we didn't drown. Being able to swim was useful when Ndlovu followed his mother up to Gauteng. She was offered a job as a domestic, working for a family in Winchester Hills in southern Joburg, and Sizwe, her son, followed her. The nearest school was Mondior High, and once enrolled, he fell under the spell of Tom Price, the rowing master. Quote, "Tom would pick me up at 5:30 in the morning," remembers Ndlovu. "I used to hear him from far, far away, coming up the hills of Winchester in his DKW Auto Union. He would take me to the gym at school in the morning, and in the afternoons we'd train on Wemmer Pan. Tom was my father." If disability was real in a social sense for Ndlovu, it was a far more literal issue for James Thompson. In his own words, Thompson had, quote, "severe learning difficulties," and was at, quote, "remedial school until grade 7. His family applied for him to attend Cape Town's elite southern suburb schools, Sachs, Bishops, Wynberg, Boys and Rondebosch, but they all turned him down. In desperation, his parents approached St. Andrews in Grahamstown, where his uncle had schooled as a boy, and he was accepted, arriving in grade 6. Before long, he was rowing, and although he continued to take Ritalin until he was 20, he didn't look back. Quote, "I won my first junior world medal in grade 10, says Thompson. Rowing was the first thing in my life that I wasn't the worst at." The third member of the South African lightweight crew at London in 2012 was Matt Britton, the second-born son of rower David. Matt's dad had narrowly missed out on qualifying a fours boat for Atlanta, and brother Lawrence is a heavyweight giant of the sport, the first ever South African to win a rowing gold medal at under 23 level internationally. Matt himself was an athlete at school, but rowing was part of the family DNA and difficult to escape. Quote, "I remember sitting down with my parents to watch Josiah Tugwani win the marathon at Atlanta, and I was 9, recalls Britton. It was a Sunday night in winter, and the following day I was outside in my vest and gym shorts, running around the garden in the freezing cold. Mom came out and asked what I was doing, and I told her that I was running because I wanted to go to the Olympics. I'd been so inspired by Josiah. I saw him as an innocent, and I liked the way he went about it. That time was pivotal for me as an athlete." Ndlovu, Thompson, and Britton were ultimately joined in the boat by Smith, although he took a complicated route to get there. Educated at St. Albans in Pretoria, Smith's main claim to fame was as a talented middle-distance athlete, but he also played water polo until he was kicked in the ear in his middle teens. His eardrum burst, and he was forbidden to go under the water, so found something to do on top of it instead. A long association with rowing was born. Smith had always dreamed of rowing with Britton. He'd seen him training on Roodeplaat Dam and appeared at the same regattas. By his own admission, quote, "He was in awe of Britton, and maybe, he thought to himself, he might just one day pair with him. Quote, he was looking for an under-23 partner, so our paths crossed. Matt has a short fuse, so at first it wasn't easy," says Smith. "Our first overseas trip was as a lightweight pair to Poznan in the Czech Republic in 2009 together. It was an epic race with us, the Italians, and the Serbians all coming to the line, and then we made a mistake. we caught a crab. Matt hit his knees with the blade, and my blade went straight into the water. We came fourth, but it was awesome to see that we could run with these guys. We could compete. Despite showing promise with Britain as a pair, Smith was compelled to bide his time. He was unable to force his way onto the lightweight four-boat that campaigned on the European summer circuit in 2010, and his upward path was blocked. The European season for the four's crew was a disaster. Quote, "The four go overseas and they get crushed," says Smith. Here's his chance, he thought. He might not have made the four's boat because he wasn't physically capable of doing so, but suddenly he was in the mix. Roger Barrow, the head coach of SA Rowing, had just recruited Paul Jackson, a two-time Olympian, to help the lightweight fours row out of their swamp, and in August 2010, Jackson arrived. Given the disappointments of the European summer, he wondered what he could do to improve the boat. First up, he changed the drills. The son of an ichthyologist based in Ginger on Lake Victoria, Paul Jackson spent much of his young life splashing about in boats. Like Thompson, he was sent to board at St Andrews in Grahamstown and, once there, discovered that, quote, "cricket wasn't for me." He rowed instead, being expelled from the rowing club for smoking and drinking before rediscovering his mojo while a student at the University of Pietermaritzburg. The splashing about in boats continued through the 1980s, including a sanctions-busting tour to the United Kingdom, during which he rowed in a competitive lightweight fours boat at Henley and Bedford. In 1987, Jackson started coaching part-time at St Stithians in Randburg, his arrival coinciding with an unprecedented period of 10-year dominance for the school. He subsequently coached crews in Atlanta and Sydney, with the botched semi-final in Atlanta being the low point of an otherwise glorious coaching career. His fours crew cruised to a relatively straightforward victory in their heat, but finished outside the top three in their semi, called tapering in rowing vernacular. Quote, "I've never been as bleak in my rowing life," Jackson said of the 1996 Olympics many years later. Barrow and Jackson's first meeting was at a Bethlehem pub. Jackson remembers an inquisition. Barrow's assistant, Dustin Butler, was there too, and the two asked him about everything from rowing style to weight transfer in the boat. Quote, "Anyway, I started introducing standard stuff for Paul Jackson," he told Lawrence Britton and Jake Green on their podcast, The Row Show, which is, if you want to win a race, even pace it. Don't get too worried about where you are after the first 500, and make sure you are running the boat and moving with it all the time. Don't try and force it in any way. Don't try and quick hands it or slow hand and go quick. That doesn't work for me. I'm more interested in how the boat runs. Jackson was an old-school coach. He wasn't interested in the newfangled methods of rowing or the Australian-derived techniques the four were using when he joined them at the Bethlehem camp. He challenged them. He prodded and poked. He muddied the waters, and he trained them to become winners. Quote, "You can't want to win when you get to a race," he once said. "You've got to want to win on the 8th day of a high-altitude camp in Lesotho, on the 14th kilometer of a road that is not going well." After the heartache of the 2010 European season, Jackson's arrival was experienced with all the excitement of a pizza slice after a month of dieting. Smith muscled a place in the boat alongside Thompson, Britton, and Ndlovu, and they gelled instantly. In later years, Smith became a firm believer in the idea of a magic crew, and this was it. The boat was full of twitchy energy. Everyone could feel it. Quote, "This boat shows so much speed, so much potential," says Smith. "We want to attack the world. We are dauntingly quick." Before the crew were able to explore their discovery, the window through which they glimpsed a brave new world was closed. Britton had struggled with back problems since leaving school. Now he was in such pain that he was struggling to sleep. Monday mornings at the High Performance Center, the HPC at Tucky's, always unfolded in the time-honored manner. Athletes were weighed and measured before filling out a standard questionnaire about their psychological health. Britain snagged halfway through, unable to complete the form. According to Thompson, he suddenly realized how negative his responses were. In a eureka moment, Britain committed to having a scan, finally addressing the pain in his back that had been plaguing him for months. Britain had surgery on a bulging disc in his lower vertebra in September 2010. It took 6 months of careful rehabilitation, Pilates and yoga to recover. The enforced layoff brought a longing to be back in the boat. Quote, "I would try to bludgeon my way through technical problems early on. It was only later that I began to appreciate the problems associated with technique," says Britain. Later that same year, at the World Championships in Lake Karapiro in New Zealand, the crew, with Tony Paladin called out of retirement as a replacement for Britain, who was still recovering from his back injury, placed 5th in the B final, effectively 11th overall. The result was a boat length short of a disaster. Back in Cape Town, Thompson talked to his parents, quote, "I told them I was going to call it a day if we didn't come right in the next 12 months, he said. And that's the polite version. We were deluding ourselves. Britain, meanwhile, was rehabilitating well. He raced a single in the Buffalo Regatta in February and won. The victory was part of a slow integration back into the squad, but by the time they flew to Bled in Slovenia for the World Cup, they had lost Ndlovu to a wrist injury. He had suffered from carpal tunnel syndrome in his right wrist for months, and he had no alternative. He needed to have an operation. From his perspective, almost the entire year was a write-off. Again, the crew had to defer the dream of the Golden Four coming together. Bled was a booby trap, and everyone knew it. The crew pulled themselves towards themselves, knowing that failure in Slovenia meant that the Olympic dream would be shattered. They needed to finish 11th, no lower, with 2 repechage places on offer later in the season, although these were only available for European crews. Britain, dynamic as ever, tried to bind the crew together. Paladin remained, and Thompson struggled to put the reservations he'd confided to his parents behind him. Smith, who was the youngest and the newest recruit, simply revelled in being on the water with the mercurial Britain. The South Africans rode a lackluster semi, so they found themselves in a B final with Poland, the Czech Republic, Germany, France, and Serbia. They started well, in the Danish manner, speeding to second position at the 500-meter mark. But their sprint was short-lived as the other crews hauled them in. By halfway, the South Africans had fallen to 4th, and by 1,500 meters, with 3/4 of the race complete, they were stone last. The B final was now a desperate fight to the death. Thompson clung doggedly to the belief that the crew would not finish last throughout the race, and although he saw the French speeding past alongside, suddenly competing with the Germans at the 1,000-meter mark, he retained his composure. There was no panic. The crew needed every shred of control and self-belief in the race's second half, because finishing last was simply not an option. With 250 meters left, the crew realized that their Olympic dreams were fading fast. Pummeling the water, they rode the fastest last 500 meters of any crew and crept into 5th place, thus qualifying for London. On the banks afterwards, the 6th-place Serbians were in tears, inconsolable. Jackson, sometimes known as Uncle Paul or P-Dog, was largely unconcerned about the Bled result, arguing that although they only came 11th, 5th in a B final behind 6 boats in the A final, in other words, it translated into a mere 5.5 seconds off the pole's winning time. Quote, "So when Sizwe came back and that gel happened, that was at least 3 of those 5.5 seconds done," said Jackson. Having recovered from the injury to his right wrist and the devastation of losing both of his parents in quick succession, Ndlovu brought new energy to the boat. He displaced Paladin, who had chosen him to be the best man at his wedding, and the boat began to fly. The crew trained hard in early 2012, trying to find ways to claw back the 5.5 seconds that separated their 11th in Slovenia from the gold medal. Almost effortlessly, they rediscovered the halcyon days before Britain's back injury. In March, with only 4 months to go until the London Olympics, they found themselves on the Sol Plaatje Dam outside of Bethlehem. In the afternoon session, Jackson paired Smith, by now nicknamed Beano or Mr. Bean with Ndlovu, while Thompson and Britton were paired together. Everyone knew that Jackson had contrived an afternoon dogfight. In the hothouse atmosphere and his eagerness to do well, Smith rowed very badly. Eventually, he gave up trying to race, simply concentrating on trying to row smoothly. Jackson didn't approve. When the session was over, Sizwe and John were asked to accompany the coach on one of his fabled walks. As they pounded out over the gravel towards the tar road, Smith remembers that things between himself, Jackson, and Ndlovu became heated. After 3 laps to the tar road and back, they were supercharged. How in fuck's name can you call that performance limp-wristed? I was watching, said Jackson. You gave up on the water. But Jesus, limp-wristed Jacko, I've given up everything to be here. You and Sizwe are great athletes. My crews don't give up. But why were we cuck, Jacko? We were cuck because we were trying something different. You want to stroke my 4? You want to sit in front and lead it, Sizwe? Don't give up. Giving up was because we were trying to row better. Giving up makes you row better? Fuck you, Jacko. Fuck you 1,000 times. We'll agree to disagree. How's that? Come back in the morning, Boot, and put your best row down on the water. 3 months before the Olympics, the South Africans found themselves confronted by Eberson's Danish crew in the final of a World Cup event in Lucerne. The South Africans were in a new boat, the Italian-manufactured Filippi, and for the first time in years they were buzzing with resolution. Old Hand Jackson suspected that the Danes had lost some of their luster, but his crew weren't so sure. Smith and Ndlovu became obsessed with Eberson, and the two of them took the opportunity to inflict some psychological damage before London. Quote, I remember saying to Sizwe during the race, I think we were 3rd or 4th, says Smith, and I looked over my shoulder and on our right was Eskild, and we came through halfway. Our calls were big attacking calls, and I remember telling Sizwe, do you want Eskild? You wanted Eskild, now we fuck him. And Jesus, we just started plowing through him, and then we managed to beat him in that race, and it was like, I couldn't believe it, managing to beat the beast of rowing. It was a huge step, creating the belief that we were going into the games in a really good space. The South Africans came second in that race behind the Chinese boat, with Great Britain 3rd and the Danes in 4th. Their second provided a huge psychological boost, supporting Thompson's later view that the media's narrative about the South Africans being underdogs in London was largely contrived. Life in the Stanford log cabins at Ebenezer outside of Zanin started well, with the caterers delivering biltong and avocado wraps. But it was cold and the accommodation was cramped and the wind howled, which meant bumpy water. The group, about 10 strong in the men's cabin, couldn't train when they wanted to because there was often early morning mist on the water. Tempers began to fray. Quote, let's put it this way, says Thompson. It was so cramped that although my head was on the other side of a thin partition, it was probably closer to the toilet seat than the guy sitting on it. Barrow and Jackson hoped that the grumpiness would be cushioned by coming off the high water at Ebenezer Dam, altitude 1,600 meters, to the comparative warmth of Zanin Dam, 700 meters down below, but the descent didn't help. This time round, the so-called land of speed held no charm. Quote, at that Zanin camp the guys started getting a bit intense, said Jackson. So I had to introduce this concept of joie de vivre. You can't take yourself too seriously. Where's the humor, Oaks? Where's the lightness? If you're too intense, the emotional energy bank goes down. Despite Zanin, Lucerne did wonders for the crew's confidence. Thomson's view that the Chinese, who had won in Switzerland, would probably bomb in London was shared by many, which effectively meant that the Golden Four had a chance of a medal, particularly if the Danes were a diminishing force. They had to keep a beady eye on the talented Great Britain crew, and the Swiss were going to be there or thereabouts. The Australians were talented but lacked a sprint finish, so fell the logic at least. With this in mind, Jackson asked Britain for a walk in Lucerne. He wanted Britain to take more of a leadership role, he said. He was sitting at 3 in the boat, dictating the rhythm and calling. Britain was apprehensive, expecting one of Jacko's famous bollockings. It didn't turn out that way. Jackson was fine-tuning. Like so many other coaches, he was simply conducting a long dialogue with regret. He didn't want a repeat of the tapering mistake he had made in his 1996 semi-final in Atlanta. As Jackson's man in the boat, Britain needed to impose himself. Months later, lying on his bed in the athletes' village after the Olympic semi-final, Britain reflected that the crew hadn't really sprinted into their second place behind the Danes. Had they chiseled out a sprint, he thought, they might actually have won. As he weighed the options of where best to call the sprint in the final, he thought back to Zanin. Although the living conditions had been cramped and the atmosphere itchy, one positive development had emerged. He'd managed to convince Jacko to allow them to hone their sprint finish. Maybe it was now worth considering where the sprint began. They could have taken the Danes in the semi, he thought. Then again, there was wisdom in not showing the Danes too much. At the same time that Britain was mulling over the pros and cons of where to start the crew's sprint finish, Jackson and Barrow were wandering down to the Costa Coffee in Egham Village. As they ordered coffees and found a booth, they discovered they were thinking exactly the same thing. Everything was falling into place, they reflected. As predicted, the Chinese, winners on Lake Lucerne, had bombed out in London, failing to make the final. The Netherlands had crept into the last 6, but their crew was dominated by the Muda brothers, Vincent and Tycho, both talented but notoriously flaky. The Great Britain crew also included 2 brothers, Peter and Richard Chambers, and were a real threat on home water. That left the Danes, the Swiss, and the Aussies probably in that order. On a good day, with a favourable wind, the South Africans had the beating of them all. With that said, Barrow and Jackson had a rule to never discuss outcomes. It was taboo. So they ruminated some more, chirping away, avoiding the elephant in the boat. Eventually, one of them took a chance. "You know, we can do this. We can. I think we can. You don't want to get too windgat. You sort of got to hold yourself back. But you're right. We can medal." Going into the final, the crew couldn't have felt better. And Ndlovu had been a revelation since returning from wrist injury. He was strong and super fit and worked well together with Smith, who sat behind him. Matric Matt, so called because of his facility with numbers, sat next along, the dynamo and the brains. The man who the crew trusted and had perfected the subtle art of calling at exactly the right time. Thomson was last. The cursing to his parents after returning from Karapiro was long gone. He felt great. He was determined to seize the moment. Quick from the start, the crew had bonded. They shared a private language. They talked about going munkle, which roughly translates into going berserk. Bino talked about to pusasa the opposition, which essentially meant to boss them. They had grown around each other's quirks and idiosyncrasies. They had learned to tolerate Thompson's roar and the constant insecurity of no sponsorship. They had almost grown fond of Jacko's intensities, his slave-driving instincts, and his threats to go for a walk. They were not intimidated by London. The Olympics was a circus. The secret, said Thompson, was to delude themselves into thinking that the final was just another race. On the night before the final, Ndlovu didn't sleep for more than 40 minutes. He listened to his favorite music, Ladysmith Black Mambazo, Jaluka, and Paul Simon, and tossed and turned. When morning dawned, he was relieved. He didn't want to spook any of the crew that he was anything less than fully refreshed, so put on a brave face at the weigh-in. While waiting to be weighed, he and Smith noticed that Eberson was in and out easily. It was virtually unprecedented. What was going on? Barrow had always felt that the bus ride to the water was a touch long, taking about half an hour. He was pleased to see that the crew was relaxed as they boarded. Smith was jabbering away, a good sign. Some of the guys had their headphones on. Quote, "They all looked pretty calm and collected," remembers Barrow, and that almost gave us confidence. Britain was sick and tired of waiting. He couldn't listen to Avril Lavigne or Sum 41's No Reason anymore. He just wanted to get on the water. Quote, "I was focusing on putting a hard race on the table," he said. "I didn't want to be distracted by thinking too much about the anthem or anything like that. I didn't want to get too far away from the result." Eventually, they were off. Unlike the semi-final, when there was rain, the day of the final was full of English summer sunshine, the day splashed with clouds and soft light. Predictably, the Danes had out in front, with the Australian crew in lane 6, to South Africa's immediate left, in other words, following closely. The South Africans tucked into the chasing pack, which consisted of them, the Great Britain crew, and the Swiss. Even early, the Netherlands had fallen noticeably behind. The boats ploughed through the water in exactly the same formation until halfway. Smith was unsettled by the Australians' early surge, but tried to not let it bother him. At the 1,000-metre mark, Britain shouted, "Our water." The crew responded with an imperceptible hastening of rhythm. Pedalling along the towpath alongside the water, Jackson could see the surge. He followed his crew with a fast-beating heart. At 1,400 meters, Britain decided to part with his secret. He had nursed it for days, cherishing the idea. With the South Africans in fourth, he uttered the words, "Big 10 now." On the command, the South Africans began their charge. The response was almost sinisterly smooth, a beautifully controlled but gradual row to the front. With 400 meters to go, Britain shouted again, loud and crisp in the enveloping roar from the stands, his crew trusting his every word. Gold was all he said. Like Eberson, Ndlovu was in the stern, the most isolated section of the boat. From it he looked at the fast receding start line, dimly aware of the flag-waving pandemonium and shouting from the stands to his right. Committed to steering the boat, he was looking backwards but steering forwards, trusting that his teammates were doing their job. When he heard Smith behind him shout, "Go, Sizwe," he was hugely comforted, and he went, rowing for all he was worth. This was it. All those Bethlehem walks with Jacko and his "we'll agree to disagree" conclusions, all his rehab after his wrist injury, all those misty mornings in Zanin, his entire being was funneled into those last 30 seconds of intensely painful beauty. In the coming days, the crew was able to reflect that under different circumstances things might have gone against them. Their winning margin over Great Britain and Denmark was excruciatingly slight. They wondered about the wisdom of the long sprint. They wondered about Eberson's counterintuitive behavior at the weigh-in, and about the serendipity of being drawn favorably in lane 5. Jacko felt it a long-standing burden going back 16 years to the Atlanta Olympics had been lifted, while Roger smiled a long smile of satisfaction. He and Paul had broken the unwritten code at Costa Coffee, talking about the result, and have gotten away with it. The secret Britain hatched while resting on his bed after the London semi was no more. He and his crew had put the mythical perfect race on the table, and they had done it where it mattered most, in an Olympic final. It was time to go out and celebrate. If you enjoyed this episode of The Luke Alfred Show, please like, share, follow, and subscribe. I write full scripts for the show in the form of long-form essays, and these are all available on my Substack. To get written episodes of The Luke Alfred Show a day early on Fridays, please check out the Luke Alfred Substack. You can hear The Luke Alfred Show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple and Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. I release a new episode every Saturday at 10:30 a.m. South African Standard Time.